Pastor Elijah King, a respected preacher in his Florida community, led a seemingly perfect life. His wife Naomi and their 5 children represented a family built on faith and trust. Deacon Henry King, Elijah's father, was a revered figure who shaped Elijah's upbringing and spiritual beliefs. Together, they were the embodiment of a devout, loving family admired by all. During a family dinner, Abigail, Elijah's eldest daughter, proposed a genealogy project for school that required DNA testing. Excited by the idea, the children eagerly joined in, while Naomi hesitated, glancing nervously at Henry. Despite her reservations, Elijah encouraged the activity, seeing it as a harmless family bonding experience. The DNA results were meant to be a light-hearted family discovery exercise, but when Elijah examined them closely, he noticed an unsettling inconsistency. The test revealed that none of the children shared his DNA. Initially, Elijah thought it might be a clerical error or a mix-up at the laboratory, so he contacted the genealogy company for clarification. However, after confirming the data, the reality became undeniable. Elijah was not the biological father of his children. This revelation cast a dark shadow over the family's history and relationships. Determined to uncover the truth, Elijah began questioning Naomi. She tried to avoid the conversation, brushing off the results as inaccurate, but Elijah's insistence broke her resolve. Finally, she confessed the shocking truth. Her children were not biologically Elijah's because they were fathered by his own father, Henry. Naomi revealed that Henry had taken advantage of her, using his authority and influence to silence her. For years she lived in fear, unable to escape the horrifying dynamic. Elijah's world shattered as he grappled with the enormity of the betrayal, not just from Naomi, but from his own father. Naomi's confession marked a devastating turning point for the King family. Confronted by Elijah's persistent demands for the truth, she finally broke her silence, her voice trembling with years of suppressed pain. She revealed the horrifying reality that the children Elijah had raised as his own were not biologically his, but were fathered by his own father, Henry. Naomi recounted how Henry had manipulated and coerced her when she was young and vulnerable, newly married to Elijah. He wielded his authority and influence as the patriarch of the family to keep her compliant, instilling fear of ruin and ostracism if she dared speak out. For years, Naomi bore the weight of this terrible secret, unable to escape the situation and terrified of the consequences of telling Elijah the truth. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, but her words offered no solace to Elijah. Instead, they ignited a firestorm of betrayal and anger. The depth of the violation shattered his trust and faith in both his wife and father, leaving him questioning everything he believed about his family and his role in it. The revelation plunged Elijah into a dark emotional abyss. He was a man who had built his life around faith, family, and his role as a respected preacher. Now, all of that seemed like a cruel joke. In the days following Naomi's confession, he withdrew from everyone, refusing to attend church or speak to his congregation. His sermons, once filled with hope and inspiration, fell silent as he grappled with the betrayal. Anger became his constant companion. He replayed Naomi's words in his mind over and over, his thoughts growing darker each time. He saw her as a complicit participant in the betrayal, and his father as a monster who had destroyed everything he held dear. The anger festered into resentment, and Elijah found himself consumed by visions of vengeance. His faith, once a source of strength, now felt hollow and mocking. He began to justify his growing rage as righteous indignation, believing that retribution was the only path to restore justice. Elijah's spiral into rage culminated in an act that would forever change the lives of everyone around him. In the days following Naomi's confession, Elijah's anger reached a boiling point. He felt trapped in a whirlwind of betrayal, shame, and a desire for justice that grew increasingly twisted. One fateful evening, as he and Naomi argued yet again in their home, the tension between them erupted into violence. The argument started as a plea from Naomi, begging Elijah to forgive her and understand the impossible situation she had been in, but Elijah's mind, clouded by anger and humiliation, heard only excuses. He lashed out verbally, calling her a liar, a traitor, and a conspirator in his father's sins. Naomi's attempts to reason with him were met with scorn, and the argument quickly escalated. In the heat of the moment, Elijah grabbed a kitchen knife. The gesture was initially one of frustration, but his mounting rage and Naomi's continued pleas only fueled his anger further. His movements became erratic, and Naomi, sensing the danger, tried to back away. In a blind fury, Elijah struck. The knife, a simple domestic tool, became the weapon of betrayal as he stabbed her repeatedly. Naomi's screams filled the house, but Elijah's rage made him deaf to her pain. When it was over, Elijah stood over Naomi's lifeless body, the knife slipping from his bloodied hands. The realization of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He sank to the floor beside her, trembling and numb, unable to process the magnitude of his actions. Yet, deep within, a dark voice whispered that this was only the beginning. Haunted by what he had done to Naomi, Elijah turned his thoughts to the man he blamed for all of it, his father, Henry. In Elijah's mind, Henry was the architect of the family's destruction, the one who had betrayed him long before Naomi's confession. Fueled by a need for retribution, Elijah resolved to confront Henry, knife still in hand. The drive to Henry's house was a blur, his mind consumed by thoughts of vengeance. When he arrived, he found Henry sitting in his living room, oblivious to the storm heading his way. Elijah burst in, brandishing the knife, and demanded answers. His voice, filled with fury and heartbreak, shook the walls of the house. Henry, taken aback by his son's sudden and violent arrival, tried to defuse the situation with denial and deflection, but Elijah was past the point of reason. He shouted accusations, waving the DNA test results in Henry's face, demanding to know why his father had ruined his life. Henry's excuses only fueled Elijah's rage further. The confrontation reached its peak when Henry attempted to downplay his actions, insisting that Naomi had been a willing participant. Those words were the final straw. Elijah snapped, lunging at his father with the knife. The struggle was brief but brutal, and Elijah's fury proved overwhelming. He stabbed Henry repeatedly, his anger exploding in each thrust. In a final horrifying act of vengeance, Elijah mutilated Henry, severing the symbol of the abuse that had destroyed his family. Henry's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor as Elijah stood over him, panting and covered in blood. Elijah's confrontation with his father, Henry, was a culmination of decades of resentment, betrayal, and untold trauma. It wasn't just a physical clash, but a battle of deeply buried truths and raw emotions. After murdering Naomi, Elijah's fury became laser-focused on the man he held responsible for all the pain, the father who had failed him and betrayed his family. Henry represented everything wrong in Elijah's shattered world, and Elijah was determined to make him pay. Elijah arrived at Henry's home late in the evening, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. The drive had been a blur, his mind consumed with chaotic thoughts. Henry, unaware of the storm coming his way, was seated in his modest living room, watching television. When Elijah burst through the door, his face a mask of fury, Henry barely had time to react. "What the hell have you done to me?" Elijah screamed, brandishing the knife like a torch of rage. Henry tried to calm his son, but his dismissive tone only stoked the fire. Elijah demanded answers about the secret Naomi had revealed, about the years of betrayal and lies that had turned his life into a facade. As Henry's responses faltered between denial and justification, Elijah's anger swelled. He accused his father of being the architect of all the pain, of taking advantage of Naomi and destroying the family's trust. Henry tried to deflect, claiming that Naomi had been complicit, that the relationship had been consensual, and that Elijah was blowing things out of proportion. But his dismissive attitude pushed Elijah beyond the brink. He lunged at Henry, the knife slicing through the air as years of bottled-up emotions exploded. A violent struggle ensued, one filled with shouts, accusations, and desperate attempts to dominate. The confrontation ended with Henry bleeding out on the floor, Elijah standing over him, panting and trembling. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, but instead of regret, he felt a grim satisfaction, a belief that justice had been served. Elijah's rage didn't end with Henry's death. As he stood over his father's lifeless body, he was consumed by a need to punish him further, to leave behind a grotesque mark of his vengeance. In a horrifying act of retribution, Elijah mutilated Henry's body, severing the symbol of his father's betrayal. This gruesome act wasn't just about vengeance. It was Elijah's way of reclaiming the power he felt Henry had stolen from him. It was a macabre declaration of victory, one that left the house soaked in blood and horror. Yet, instead of feeling closure, Elijah felt hollow. As the adrenaline faded, Elijah sat on the floor amidst the carnage, his hands stained with blood and his mind clouded. The weight of his actions began to set in, but he made no attempt to flee. Instead, he waited, numb and detached, for the inevitable arrival of the authorities. The aftermath of the murders unfolded like a slow, inevitable unraveling. Elijah's brutal actions sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone who knew him questioning how a man of faith could fall so far. In the days following his arrest, the town of Linfield, a close-knit, quiet place where families had known each other for generations, became a town in mourning. The once respected preacher, a pillar of strength and moral guidance, had shattered the trust and respect he had spent years cultivating. Neighbors and parishioners couldn't comprehend what had happened. Elijah had always been a man of God, a man they believed to be compassionate and wise. How could he have descended into such a monstrous act? The local churches that had once filled with the sound of his sermons now sat silent, their pews empty, as people grappled with the unfathomable truth. Police worked tirelessly to piece together the details of the murders, but what was most haunting to them wasn't the brutality of the killings, it was the calmness with which Elijah had surrendered himself. He had shown no remorse when officers found him sitting on the porch of his father's house, a knife in his lap, the blood of his father and wife still staining his clothes. The silence of his surrender spoke volumes about the emotional wreckage that had consumed him. Days after Elijah's arrest, the full extent of Naomi's death came to light. Authorities, having already discovered Henry's body in his home, turned their attention to Naomi's remains. They found her in a gruesome state in their shared bedroom. Elijah had hidden her body under blankets in a twisted attempt to conceal the crime. Her lifeless form, battered and broken, painted a clear picture of the horrific violence she had endured. The discovery was agonizing for the small town. Naomi had been a beloved figure, a woman known for her kindness, her devotion to her family, and her role in the local community. To learn that she had been murdered by the very man who had once sworn to protect her was a blow to the heart of the town. Investigators were horrified by the details of Naomi's death, how she had begged Elijah for mercy in her final moments, how she had tried to run, but ultimately could not escape the rage that had overtaken her husband. The discovery marked the end of a search for closure, but instead of healing, it only deepened the sorrow of those left behind. Elijah's confession came as a shock, but not in the way the authorities or the community might have expected. When Elijah was arrested, there were hopes that perhaps there was some rational explanation for his actions, but Elijah's confession, delivered with cold precision, shattered any notions of a momentary lapse of judgment or an uncontrollable rage. In a matter-of-fact, almost detached tone, Elijah spoke about the series of events that had driven him to murder the two people closest to him, his wife Naomi and his father Henry. As he sat in the sterile interrogation room, his eyes staring blankly at the officer in front of him, Elijah didn't appear like the man who had once led his congregation with passion and faith. Instead, he seemed hollow, devoid of emotion, as if recounting an event that had no real bearing on his life. His confession was chilling because there was no remorse, no regret. There was only the cold calculation of a man who believed his actions were justified. He began by explaining how Naomi's infidelity with his father had festered in his mind for months before it consumed him. He detailed the pain of having his trust shattered by two people he had loved and admired most in his life. He spoke of the rage that had simmered within him when Naomi admitted the affair, how it tore him apart, and how in that moment his belief in everything, his faith, his family, his very identity, had been shattered. When the police asked him about his state of mind at the time, Elijah was blunt. "I couldn't let it go. I couldn't forgive her," he said. "And then my father tried to justify his actions. It was the ultimate betrayal." He recounted how, once he had confronted Naomi and Henry, something inside of him snapped. In his mind, this wasn't a crime, it was an act of revenge, of justice. Elijah seemed to believe that he was right in punishing both of them. There was no guilt in his voice as he described the murders. It was almost as though he was telling a story about someone else. As Elijah's confession unraveled, the detectives sat stunned, trying to process the gravity of what they were hearing. What was clear was that Elijah believed he had been wronged on a cosmic scale, and he had decided to make Naomi and Henry pay for that wrong in the most violent of ways. But what disturbed the investigators most was the lack of guilt or empathy in his words. Elijah spoke of his actions with the coldness of someone recounting a distant memory, unable to truly grasp the enormity of the destruction he had caused. News of Elijah's confession spread quickly throughout Linfield, and the shock that followed was almost unbearable. The preacher, who had been a figure of moral authority, the man who had guided and counseled so many, was now revealed to be a cold-blooded murderer. It was as if the very foundation of the community had been torn apart. The people who had once flocked to his sermons, seeking comfort and inspiration, could not come to terms with the fact that the man who had stood before them in the pulpit was now responsible for the brutal deaths of two beloved community members. How could this happen? How could a man who had been so revered turn so violently against those he should have loved the most? The town was torn in two. Some could not accept the truth, still clinging to the belief that Elijah had somehow been manipulated or driven mad by the circumstances. They speculated that he had been pushed to the edge by the scandal and had lost control, but others, particularly those closest to Naomi and Henry, were filled with a burning sense of outrage. How could Elijah, who had once preached about love, forgiveness, and redemption, turn into a monster? They felt betrayed, disgusted by the actions of a man they had trusted with their spiritual well-being. The grief was compounded by the horror of Naomi's and Henry's deaths. Naomi, a devoted wife and mother, had been taken from them in the most violent way possible. Her children were left without a mother, and the town mourned the loss of a woman who had been a cornerstone of the community. Henry, too, was mourned by those who had known him, even though his betrayal had cast a shadow on his memory, but the most devastating loss was the emotional destruction that reverberated through the community. People had lost more than just two individuals. They had lost the faith they had once placed in the preacher, in the church, and in the idea that the people they trusted could do such terrible things. Elijah's trial was the event that consumed Linfield. It was as if the entire town had come to a standstill, all eyes fixed on the courtroom, all minds focused on the man who had once held their spiritual trust in his hands. The proceedings were a spectacle, with reporters arriving from surrounding towns to cover the trial of the fallen preacher. For the community, it was more than just a trial, it was a reckoning. In the courtroom, Elijah was a far cry from the charismatic preacher who had once delivered moving sermons to packed congregations. Now he sat quietly, his face expressionless, his demeanor that of a man who had already resigned himself to his fate. His defense attorneys argued that Elijah had been driven to madness by the affair, the betrayal of both his wife and father eating away at his sanity. They claimed he had lost touch with reality in his emotional and mental breakdown. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a picture of a cold and calculating murderer. They emphasized that Elijah had not acted in a fit of rage but had carefully planned and executed the murders. They presented evidence of Elijah's calm demeanor before and after the killings and his lack of remorse during his confession. The prosecution argued that Elijah had chosen to murder his wife and father as a way of reclaiming control over a life that had spiraled out of his grasp. As witnesses took the stand, the emotional toll on the people of Linfield became evident. Naomi's family members spoke about the woman they had lost, her kindness, her love, and her devotion to her children. The townspeople who had known Henry for years were divided. Some still believed he had acted out of some twisted sense of love for Naomi, while others felt his betrayal of Elijah was unforgivable. The children, too, spoke about the devastation they had experienced in losing both parents in such a brutal way. The trial lasted several weeks, with intense testimony, legal wrangling, and emotional outbursts from the victims' families. In the end, it was clear that Elijah's actions could not be justified by the pain he felt from the affair. His brutality and lack of remorse painted him as a man who had crossed a line from tragedy to monstrosity. After days of deliberation, the jury finally returned with their verdict. Elijah was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news spread like wildfire through the town, and there was an overwhelming sense of relief. Though the verdict would not bring Naomi or Henry back, it was a step toward justice for their families and the town at large. Elijah's expression remained unchanged as the verdict was read. There was no visible shock, no sign of guilt, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. It was as though he had already detached himself from the reality of his crimes. The courtroom was silent except for the sobs of Naomi Naomi's family and the murmurs of the audience, Elijah's fate was sealed, but the real work of healing would be much harder for the people of Linfield. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that felt fitting but also hollow, a reminder of the lives lost and the destruction Elijah had left in his wake. With their mother gone and their father imprisoned, Elijah's children were left to fend for themselves. They were sent to live with Naomi's family, but their new life was fraught with difficulty. The emotional scars they carried were deep. They had been raised by a man who had taught them faith, discipline, and love, only to learn that he was capable of such horrific acts. The sense of betrayal they felt was incomprehensible. The children were not only grieving the loss of their mother, but also the loss of their father. Their entire world had been upended, and they found it difficult to adjust to a life without either parent. Therapy was offered to help them process their trauma, but nothing could erase the images of their mother's violent death or the knowledge that their father had taken her life. The town rallied around the children, offering support, but the damage was done. The once promising future that Elijah had envisioned for them now seemed bleak. They would have to grow up with the weight of their father's crimes on their shoulders, and that burden would follow them for the rest of their lives. Linfield was never the same after Elijah's fall. The town, once a place of peace and spiritual guidance, now carried a heavy sense of loss. Naomi's absence was felt by all who had known her. She had been more than just a mother and a wife. She had been a friend, a mentor, and an active member of the community. Her death was a wound that could never fully heal. Elijah's betrayal had fractured the community's faith, and it took years for people to begin to trust again. The churches, once filled with congregants eager to hear Elijah's sermons, now stood empty. People had been left to question everything they had believed in. Elijah, the man who had once been a source of spiritual guidance, was now a symbol of destruction and betrayal. The town tried to rebuild, but there was always a lingering sadness in the air, a reminder of the horrors that had occurred. People who had once greeted each other with smiles now avoided eye contact, and the streets seemed quieter, more somber. The emotional toll was evident in the faces of the townspeople. The tragedy had taken something from them that they would never be able to reclaim. Years passed, but the events surrounding Elijah's crimes remained a haunting reminder to the people of Linfield. Every anniversary of Naomi's death was marked with a solemn remembrance, and every time the town gathered for a community event, there was an undercurrent of unease. The memory of Elijah's fall never truly faded from their minds. The town couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. How had someone they had trusted so completely ended up destroying so many lives? Elijah's name, once spoken with reverence, was now uttered in hushed tones. People still wondered if there had been signs they missed, if there had been ways they could have stopped him before it was too late. The haunting presence of what had happened lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the fragility of trust and the darkness that can hide behind even the most devout faces. As time went on, the people of Linfield were left with the painful task of reflection. Elijah's fall from grace was a story that defied explanation. How could a man who had preached love and forgiveness turn into the very thing he had condemned? What had driven him to such violence? Some believed Elijah's fall was a consequence of the toxic combination of pride and pain. Others saw it as the result of deep psychological turmoil, a man unable to reconcile the image of himself as a faithful husband and father with the reality of betrayal. But for many, Elijah's descent into murder was a tragic reminder of how easily even the most revered can falter.